Since 1933, the city of Port of Spain has been dealing with significant flooding. Decades have passed and it seems very little has changed. Kalain Hosein takes an in-depth look at why the nation's capital continues to flood year after year in part 1 of A City Under Water.
For decades, the city of Port of Spain has flooded multiple times annually. Why year in and year out has this problem persisted, given as far back as 1933, the city has suffered from significant flooding? To understand, you must first know how the country floods. Trinidad and Tobago experiences several types of flooding. The one that you may have heard of is riverine flooding. That occurs when significant rains fall over a large portion of the country, causing our major watercourses and rivers to overtop its banks, and that occurs in the St. Joseph River right next to me, or the Kalain River all the way to my back. Now, when these rivers overtop, they cause flooding for several days across a large portion of the country. But in Port of Spain, we don't usually see riverine flooding, as water tends to run off quite quickly. There are 3 types of flooding that mainly affect the capital. They include coastal flooding, flash flooding, and street or urban flooding. Coastal flooding is as its name suggests, water moving onshore from a nearby sea or ocean. Trinidad and Tobago, this happens for a couple of reasons. We have tropical storms producing storm surge that floods low-lying areas, long period swells that produce large battering waves in nearshore bays and beaches. We also have higher than usual high tides, and that's combined with elevated sea level rise due to climate change and global warming that floods coastal areas. Now, in Port of Spain, we also have another feature, that's thunderstorms that move northward along the coast of the Gulf of Paria, producing large waves that batter the northern coastlines of Trinidad. Now, in Port of Spain itself, we don't usually see a lot of coastal flooding. And that's because the main features for floods tend to be thunderstorms that produce street and flash flooding. Street flooding is the most common type of flooding in Port of Spain. It occurs when heavy rainfall overwhelms the drainage network, causing flooding in low-lying areas and areas where drains are no longer sufficient to capture the volume of water that falls. In a changing climate, this will become more frequent in cities like Port of Spain and other major cities, not only in the country, but across the world. Flash flooding is an intense high-velocity torrent of water that comes down in an existing watercourse, and it can happen on the order of minutes to hours. Now, flash flooding is incredibly dangerous due to the high-velocity nature of the water, and it can bring down large rocks and debris like you see strewn behind me, and even cars like we saw earlier in 2021. Now, water here in the upper East Dry River makes its way down to lower Port of Spain and can produce some catastrophic consequences like we saw earlier this year. So now we know how it floods across the country and in the capital. But why is it still flooding? Port of Spain is located at sea level, where 2 major rivers, the Maraval River to the west and the St. Anne's or East Dry River to the east, meets. Water from the mountains of the northern range funnel into these concrete limited waterways and habitually overflow during heavy rainfall. The impact of climate change causing more intense thunderstorms will result in more of these flash flood events. Port of Spain's Mayor Joel Martinez also pointed to the unsuitable drainage for a developed city as a major cause.
Apart from that, you have what you call drainage issues in the city of Port of Spain, because the infrastructure, which is the drainage that is in Port of Spain, has been over 100 years old. So the drains, the capacity of the drains are smaller than what when there was a lot less development in the city of Port of Spain, and those drains were supposed to spill out into those rivers and then eventually into the sea. So what has happened is, because the city has built up and then the drainage has not kept time with it, that is really and truly why there's that issue of flooding.
One topic that also remains untouched and not well regulated is hillside development. As we continue to cut down trees and clear for housing and roads, we reduce the soil's ability to hold water and prevent a deluge from reaching these rivers. But with limited drain capacity and the impact of heavier rains over a short period, there is another factor that hasn't entered the equation: the impact of littering.
You have the the residents or citizens that utilize, that live close to the river, that throw solid waste into the rivers, tree cuttings. When they cut down a tree, they throw the whole tree into the river, or they would throw a washing machine or a dryer or old stove or something like that. And then you have those people who utilize plastic bottles, and when they finish with the bottle, they throw it into the canal. And then the rains come and carry the bottles down into the underground drain, and then that goes into the main watercourses. So that's when you see the capacity of the drain now being even further overloaded by a result of the fact that they have obstacles. And then if something blocks that small drain along the way, like at one point in time we found a barrel inside of one of the drains down there by the east Port of Spain, which is where the taxi stand is, and that created massive flooding in the city at one point in time.
During the drive around the city, there was an abundance of litter.
When you have these things happening and we can't clean the drains as fast enough as the people who dirty them, because the city is being used every day by people, and it's a transient population, so they don't live in the city, a lot of people, and when they don't live in the city, they don't care too much about what happens to the city. They're gone, you know.
In a Joint Select Committee report published in 2020, the Ministry of Works presented evidence to the Parliament that there was no floodgate system preventing the flow of water during high tide. A critical drain on Henry Street under the PTSE building has collapsed on Wrightson Road, and utilities such as WASA and NGC breached the structural integrity of some culverts, contributing to its collapse. So we know what is happening, and we also know why it's happening, but what is being done about it? We'll explore what has been done and the challenges the city faces in part 2 of A City Underwater. Kalain Hosein, CNC3 News.
Tomorrow night, part 2 of Kalain's City Underwater. Thanks for viewing. Thanks. Welcome back again to Unspun. I'm your host, Mark Besant. In part 1 of A City Underwater, we discovered the major causes of flooding in the nation's capital. Decades have gone and most of these issues still remain unaddressed. Tonight in part 2 of A City Underwater, we learn how the city and the government is trying to make Port-of-Spain more flood and climate resilient, as well as the major hindrances the city is facing. Kalain Hosein explains.
Look at the place, Bombo Cloud.
It takes mere minutes of rainfall to bring Port-of-Spain to its knees. An hour or more can cripple travel for an entire evening. The issue of flooding in Port-of-Spain is not new, and for decades, mayors have come and gone saying floods will become a thing of the past. So what exactly has been done to address this near-monthly event during the wet season? The current Port-of-Spain Mayor, Joel Martinez, recognized this problem early on, and his approach to dealing with the matter took him internationally.
I met with the IDB, and they took me to various parts of the world to see what drainage would look like in other countries, and how you park water aside, or how you enhance your infrastructure, and you use strategy to, retention ponds and all these sort of different things. And they did indicate that there was a loan facility to be able to assist the city of Port-of-Spain in flooding. What had happened over that period of time was that a number of studies were done in the city over the years by various engineering firms, and those plans were just there. They were not executed on. And that was a time that we had a lot of money that we could have executed on the plans very easily, and they were even offered soft loans by the Inter-American Development Bank and so on to really structure the process to be able to allow to alleviate flooding as best as possible. And that was really in the area of the Central Business District. because we knew that that was the area for high commerce and so on, and it was high traffic where you have the city gate area and that sort of thing.
But these plans and travels never came to fruition, leaving the nation's capital with the same drainage network we've had for the last century. However, as the pandemic hit, funding dried up and now flooding has shifted to the city's back burner.
Yes, you can improve the capacity, you can change a lot of things if you have the financing to be able to do it. And at this point in time, the financing, as you would know, for the economy of Trinidad and Tobago is rather low, and we also and then to top that, we end up battling a pandemic that we have had to utilize funds that we really didn't have, so you had to borrow more money to utilize funds for the people's health and to stay alive, and to put infrastructure in place to be able to deal with COVID-19. So flooding would have gotten it would have moved off the priority list and go into what you call the secondary list, until we do have some kind of additional funding that we can really deal with flooding in a major way.
It then begs the question, what was the holdup? Why did the city not press ahead with these plans and loans?
I can't say what was the holdup. I wasn't the mayor then. My public life was in a different direction, and because I was part of Diego Martin, and they also experienced a lot of flooding issues in the Maraval area, and we did attempt at a number of occasions to deal with the flooding and have dealt with it to some extent.
What the city has chosen to do in the interim, until funds begin flowing back into the city, is to crank up maintenance and ensure when water hits the ground, it can flow freely.
Now is the time that we are experiencing climate change. We're experiencing all the different, the higher levels of flooding. What we have been trying to do as a city, since we have no money, is to keep the drains constantly clean, and so maintenance is foremost in our mind.
The mayor, while appealing to the public to refrain from littering, is also calling for the people to change their habits.
What we need to do is to talk to the population now and say, listen, keep telling them to not drop solid waste into the rivers. Call the corporation. You can get a truck to pick up your solid waste. When you cut down a tree or you want to cut down a tree, ask us for assistance. We will cart it away, for a small fee, things like that. We can find so many ways to deal with it in the meantime. And it's just that the citizen has to change some of their habits and so on.
Inciting a behavioral change is a slow-moving process. We've seen that with COVID-19. However, the city is making material steps to become more resilient, not just to flooding, but other disasters as well.
Up to recently, we had a joint venture with the Habitat for Humanity to make Port of Spain a resilient city by 2030. And part of that is to look at the landslip development, look at how roofs fall off, look at drainage, and all these different things to be able to sustain an earthquake or a hurricane or a difficult rainfall, that sometimes could affect us and create massive flooding.
Even as Port of Spain attempts to become a more flood-resilient city, there's another factor working against it: vandalism. This flood pump installed at the Port of Spain lighthouse was cost millions of dollars and was recently vandalized, rendering the flood pump inoperable and could cause chaos the next time rain comes down in the city.
Here you have where we've worked and we've spent money, a couple $1 million to put these pumps in place to alleviate flooding, and then what happens is somebody vandalizes it. Who doesn't care about the development of the city because they want to address their own personal relief?
And for the ventures the city did spend money on, it seems there was not a return on investment. Unspun, speaking with the mayor on a very noticeable flood alert system in East Port of Spain, articulated the following.
We purchased an early warning system, and from what I understand, after purchasing it, which was on the advice of the city engineer, we've never heard any reports as to how, whether it's working, whether it's not working, whether it needed some form of technology or whatever it is, it appears as though they purchased the item, but they didn't. I can't give you any information on what has happened thereafter because it has not been forthcoming.
So what's next for the city?
What is required to be done in a major way is to find a way to reduce the speed of the water that comes down the river, starting with some form of retention process that starts in the Maraval and St. Anne's area before it enters into the Port of Spain area. And that would take some serious money. However, in the meantime, all that we can do is to ensure that the drains are cleared and that we have our teams on standby, and we encourage the citizens not to throw solid waste into the rivers, and then hope for the best thereafter, that it's not a high tide when we have a system that really overpowers the infrastructure that we have.
Littering, poor urban planning, and hillside development, to name a few factors, will continue to exacerbate runoff and block waterways. With torrential rainfall and a limited capacity drainage network, very little can be done to prevent drains, streams, and rivers from being overwhelmed. Unless significant capital is expended to address drainage appropriately and regular maintenance of watercourses are conducted, a spilled bucket of water could still be enough to cripple a city.
Thanks for joining us on Unspun, and we'll have another interesting story in 2 weeks' time inside the CNC3 News.